Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guests today are Izabella Tabarovsky and Richard Byrne. Richard is editor of the Wilson Center's award-winning online magazine, The Wilson Quarterly, and Izabella is a senior program associate with the Kennan Institute and also one of the contributors to the fall issue of the WQ, which is titled The Ends of History. Welcome to both of you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Great to be here.
So, Richard, let's begin with a bit of an overview of the issue. The tagline, "The past is always with us, even when governments try to alter or erase it. How does contested history shape our politics and culture?" Tell us about the theme.
Well, I mean, the phrase that everyone remembers is that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. What this issue is really looking at is how governments will foreground elements of their history, alter the narrative, or even erase history to achieve particular political or cultural ends. And the 20th century and into our 21st century is sort of chock full of these kinds of, I would say, interventions into historical narrative for political purposes. And we thought it would make a great issue.
Tell us about some of the contributors and some of the topics covered.
So we have a terrific crew of contributors for this issue. I think I would like to first highlight Jonathan Holloway, president of Rutgers, who was also the Wilson Center's 2020 Hubert H. Humphrey Fellow. And I was able to sort of create an article that wove a lecture that he gave in February 2020 about Woodrow Wilson's legacy on racial injustice and racial equality in the United States. And of course, President Holloway gave that lecture in February, and in the intervening months, we had immense racial reckoning in this country. So in September, he very kindly agreed to sit down with me and basically go over how the last few months have affected his view of Wilson, racial memory. And I think the article really is a great opportunity for the Wilson Center and the Wilson Quarterly to reflect on Wilson's legacy. One of the things that Jonathan Holloway says in that article is that historians are trying to capture the full humanity of somebody. Everybody deserves their full humanity being rendered. And I think that sounds very positive, like everybody needs their good side and their bad side. But it also is, for me, kind of the reverse, that figures who have a certain greatness need to have their flaws examined as well in our contemporary culture and what they mean to our contemporary culture. So it really was, that article was a terrific chance for us to look at Woodrow Wilson and see where we are at today in research and scholarship on his life and his politics. We also have an amazing article by Zheng Wang, a former global fellow here at the center, about China and its propaganda apparatus, which kicked into very high gear after the Tiananmen Square suppression in 1989, and he wrote a book about this that took us up to basically the early part of the 21st century. And in his essay in this WQ, he looks at the last 8 years since he published his book and how that process in the Chinese government has deepened and intensified and really created an entirely different sort of nationalism than we had even known from China in the late 1980s and early 1990s. We also have a terrific article about the Democratic Republic of Congo and the continuing colonial legacy and the damage it's done to that country. That was occasioned in particular by the fact that in the aftermath of the protests here in the United States about Black Lives Matter and the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Belgian citizens protested in solidarity and also began to deface the statues of King Leopold II, who was the creator of the Belgian colonial state in the Congo. So we were able to kind of have a story that kicked off with a very clear hook to contemporary news events, but was a very deep look at how the Congo has responded in the last 6 decades to its colonial heritage. And we also have 2 other stories I'll mention very quickly. One story is reported from Mexico about victims of disappearances there in the 1970s and the continuing quest for of those families in a current climate where political disappearances are once again becoming prevalent in Mexico. And we also have a wonderful essay about public art in the former Yugoslavia that were abstract public art that celebrated the partisan victories over fascism and how contested and political those monuments are. So we have a really great issue, and it's very much capped off by Izabella's lead essay on Russia and its memory of World War II.
Expert segue there, Richard. Thank you very much. Izabella, you know, one of the things that I never cease to be amazed by is that how fluid our understanding of history is. You know, when we're introduced to history as grade school children, it's all pretty black and white, right? And there's a certain sense of certainty. History is over. We understand it. Here it is. But what we find out is that it's a moving target. It never stays the same. And Izabella, your essay, Russia's Lost War, it also depends on where you're looking at history from, right? If you're looking from the outside into a nation or a culture, or you're looking from the inside out. Talk to us about what you tried to capture in your piece.
Sure. And I would like to actually remark on something you said about history being a moving target. I think that it's something that I've learned from speaking to so many historians over the years, is that every new generation asks new questions of the past. So history is a certain set of facts that are there, but we choose narratives and we choose stories that answer certain questions that trouble us. What I tried to capture in my essay is also something that I've thought about for many years, have written about, is the fact that the way Russia tells its national story on the national level about World War II and its victory in World War II erases so many inconvenient facts. So it erases, as I wrote in the piece, it erases groups that in Soviet times were thought to be unwanted, that somehow they spoiled the picture, such as the severely injured veterans. The story erases, in a way, it erases women. Women fought, hundreds of thousands of women fought, millions of them volunteered for different services at the front. And you will see articles today talking about women. It's not that they're not, it's not that their contributions are not remembered at all, but on the national level, it is still very much the brave Red Army soldiers, men who brought back that victory. And so there is, and then of course there are Stalin's repressions that preceded the war, that continued throughout the war, that continued after the war. And certainly that part is never brought too closely into the conversation about the war and the victory in the war.
Izabella, for those who choose what we focus on, the state or official voices, and these aren't your words, but mine, it almost amounts to a bit of a cover-up, if not just the distortion of reality. What's the motivation? Why do they do that?
Well, this is a really important point, because it creates it illustrates the difference between historians and politicians. Historians always try to complicate the narrative. They try to bring in all the shades of gray. Politicians are driven by a different mission. Their mission is to give the nation a certain narrative that maybe serves their personal purposes. Maybe it serves the purposes that they believe that this is what's good for the nation. So therefore, we're going to use this narrative. And so they go to the past and they pick and choose the facts that serve them. And in Russia, there is one of the objectives in teaching about the past is very much to foster patriotism, to kind of overcome the perceived shame. This is how President Putin views it, the shame of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so this is very much the phrase that's used is it's about Russia rising from her knees. And this becomes the objective in the way the stories about the past are crafted.
So you're crafting the past in order to influence your present and your future.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Russia, of course, is not the only one who does it. It's very typical. I'm sure it's very typical of many different countries, but certainly in the post-communist space, where the collapse of the system created this radical break. And everybody knew that in Soviet times, history was a tool of manipulation. It was manipulated itself. And during perestroika, new facts began to emerge. The truth of history actually was a really important part of perestroika. And then over the next decades, all these different countries began to craft their own narratives by the politicians.
Yeah, well, I always think of it as the power of myth, right? If you go to ancient civilizations, Rome or Greece, and you'll find statues to Zeus or the gods. Here in the United States, in Washington, D.C., you find these cathedrals to Washington or Jefferson, and really they become these mythological characters, almost gods from Mount Olympus. So as you say, it's not uncommon. But it does lead to a question of, as I read your essay and the others, is who owns history? Who defines it for us? And is this a competition that just never ends? And I'd like your thoughts on this, Izabella, but yours as well, Richard.
This is a really, really excellent point. And I think the answer to this question, and I don't think there is a definitive answer, but the answer very much depends on what kind of a society we're talking about. In an authoritarian society, there is the overwhelming influence of the state, for sure. In a highly authoritarian society, such as the Soviet Union, certainly the state owns history. When you have a society such as ours in the United States, you can have a dialogue, and this is what we're having now. It's a conversation that's wide-ranging, in which numerous people and organizations, professional, non-professional activists are taking place. And in the end, whatever consensus we achieve, if we ever do achieve a consensus, will be based on this wide-ranging conversation and discussion. And I suspect that this conversation and discussion will never really end, or it won't end for a while. It will always be subject to discussion and conversation. And I would also add that in Russia, even though there is, and I write about that in the essay, even though there is certainly that very strong presence of the state narrative, you still have a very strong presence also of the grassroots memory, and that complements it. It's not as present, let's say, in state media, in newspapers, on television, but it exists. It's present at the grassroots level.
But you also tell the story of the Immortal Regiment and the state's attempt to then co-opt that grassroots level. Let's come back to that in a second, but first let's let Richard weigh in on the question of who owns history.
Well, I think Izabella makes a really terrific point, and I'd like to simply just build off of it and say that, history belongs to all of us, really, and it only teaches or instructs us if we listen. Otherwise, and somewhat akin to nature itself, it punishes. And this is something that I think is very much in the air right now in the United States, as we're involved in an electoral campaign, and there are a lot of contested histories. Even the history of the last 8 years is very contested. So it does belong to all of us, and we all have a stake in it, and our posture towards it will really determine what it can give to us.
Yeah, we've seen the citizen journalist movement. Maybe this is a citizens historians movement as well. Izabella, back to your piece and the Immortal Regiment. Tell our viewers about the Immortal Regiment and how it factors into the story.
Sure. So the Immortal Regiment is a movement that began a few years ago. It was established by a group of independent journalists in the Siberian city of Tomsk. And the motivation for this initiative was that certainly one of them, lost his grandfather who had fought in the war, and he realized that he really missed having that personal connection. Every May 9th, which is the biggest holiday in Russia, really, and increasingly becoming the most important holiday, or commemorative holiday, he realized that he and his young daughter would go to the streets and to the parade and find a veteran and talk to the veteran, because it was sort of an antidote to the official loud, sometimes grotesque commemorations that can happen as people try to celebrate this, which was a very meaningful victory, but it really began to kind of lose that personal meaning. So he and his friends established it as an independent movement, a way to walk through the streets with the portraits of their loved ones who fought in the war or in some way maybe participated in the war. Maybe they were in the hinterland working for the benefit of the front. So very, very personal. The idea was to reflect on the grief that each family had. And in Russia, truly, in all Soviet states, most families have some kind of a connection to the war. So this became incredibly popular, very quickly exploded into, I think within 2 years, people were marching in 500 towns, cities, and villages. Very personal, very meaningful. And the state saw it, and the state saw the benefit of it, and it saw the value of it, the fact that it was personal and valuable, and it also was proactive. So instead of people sitting at home and watching the parade on the TV, they could actually put in their own heart and soul into it. And so the state came in and attempted to co-opt it, and they, in fact, did co-opt it. And today, Immortal Regiment is not what it was originally. It's very much a state-driven initiative. It now exists throughout the world. Wherever there is a Russian diaspora or Russian embassy, they organize something like this. And so you see, again, kind of a retreat from the meaning. A lot of times people carry portraits that they were just simply given by organizers. These are not their loved ones. And it's not anymore about reflecting on the grief and the personal meaning, but it's about joining in the triumphalist message that the state likes to convey.
You know, there's a quote that I'm searching for, and it's something like this, that ideas become movements, and then movements become businesses, and businesses become rackets. And it sounds like, unfortunately, that's the arc.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So tell us, I want to ask you about another character in your tale, Marshal Constantine Rusovsky. Tell us about him, because it really indicates a real duality here of Russian history and what they're trying to reconcile.
Absolutely. And it's something that a lot of times you wouldn't necessarily even think about. But in the piece, I describe one of the most kind of iconic images from the very first victory parade that took place on June 24th, 1945, where the people who marched were people who were at the front just weeks ago. Marshal Rusovsky commanded the parade, and there is a moment where he is meeting Marshal Zhukov, who's reviewing the parade, and they are both on these stunning stallions on the Red Square. Stalin is looking at them, and you would be forgiven if you didn't realize that Rokossovsky, who's truly the hero of the war, one of the engineers of the victory over Nazi Germany, just a few years before that, just some 8 years before that, had been arrested and tortured as part of the widespread repression against the Red Army Officer Corps that was engineered by Stalin. It was a devastating event for the army, and it actually left the Red Army defenseless, in terrible shape, and it's very much responsible for some of the early losses that the Red Army experienced in the early months of the war. It's something that Russia doesn't like to talk about. Of course, it talks about its victimhood, but all of the blame for the victimhood is on Nazi Germany, and it's appropriate in a way. But you also have to remember that had they not arrested and murdered so many of their officers, the outcome may have been different in those early years. And Rokossovsky was lucky. He survived the tortures. He never signed a confession. He was brought back out when they realized that they needed good commanders, and he proved himself. He served, and when Stalin died and Khrushchev gave his famous secret speech, he directly named him as one of the truly patriotic people who was innocent, did not deserve to be victim of the repressions.
So ultimately, I know this is sort of a trite question in that it's an ongoing struggle, but in Russia currently, who's winning the battle for history?
Well, I'm afraid that it's a really good question. I'm afraid that the state is winning. And it's important to understand that it's not that the state outright suppresses this history. They do it in a different way. You know, there is a different way to propagate disinformation, right? You don't necessarily have to lie about things, but you can sort of distort things a little bit. You can push them aside, you can marginalize them, you can avoid naming certain things. So for example, as I was writing this piece, I think I saw a documentary, maybe even a couple documentaries that were shown on Russia's federal channels about Rokossovsky. And they mentioned the fact that he was arrested, that he had been tortured and all that. But the way they do it, you would never guess who was guilty, who instigated it. And so what you have is sometimes sometimes they talk about it, and here I'm quoting one of the leading memory activists in Russia, who is no longer with us, unfortunately, Arsenii Roginsky, but he likes to say that in Russia, they talk about repressions, or the government talks about repressions, as if it was a natural disaster, as if it just came and swept the country. There were no people who were guilty. They haven't prosecuted the guilty parties. They still don't like to talk about Stalin as having been guilty. Having said that, Putin did participate in the opening of this major state memorial to the victims of political repressions. So it's complicated, and the short answer to your question is, I would say that despite numerous efforts by various memory activists, I would say that overall the state is winning.
Thanks, Richard. When you play your role as editor and you look at all the pieces, do you see some common themes emerge, best practices, anything instructive where you might get a different outcome of who's winning the war for history?
Well, it's really fascinating. I mean, just to jump off from what Izabella just so wonderfully put, the repression, Stalin's repressions seem to be too big to ignore, but not too big to reshape and to shake off and to do different things with. And I think that there's a common theme in all the stories. It is that there's a constant pressure, whether it's the grassroots, whether it's historians, to reopen the case, to look at the facts anew, and hope that we can draw different useful conclusions, not just for our common knowledge and culture, but also for our politics, to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. I would point readers maybe to the essay about the monuments, the spomenici they're called, in former Yugoslavia, and the history that's encapsulated in those monuments is really it really shows you sort of the ups and downs of history, that they were starting to be conceived when Yugoslavia was in a sort of Tito-Stalinist period. And then there was when Tito and Stalin had their very famous conflict, it did sort of liberate elements of the Yugoslav society into this really bold artistic expressions and commemorations that managed to elide politics, but also make a sort of common structure that people could gain access to. And immediately when Yugoslavia fell apart, these monuments were seen as, in many cases, as a discredited elephants in the room of former Yugoslavia. So Dusan Velichkevich wrote the essay, and Donald Niebel, who's created an amazing website of these spomenici, were able to collaborate with me in taking readers through that whole trajectory of history, much in the same way that Isabella's article does. And I think those are the lessons, that history is long, history changes, and it is open to, re-examination and reinterrogation all the time.
Well, thanks, Richard. Congratulations on another terrific issue of the WQ. Isabella, terrific essay too. And we've given quite a preview of it today, but still people should read it. And one of the things I love to do, you're welcome, is I love to give a plug when we're not selling anything, when we're giving it away. Richard, how can people read the quarterly, and where can they find the new issue?
So the Wilson Quarterly is a free publication. It is published online. So you can direct your browser to wilsonquarterly.com, and it's right there for you. We also urge people to subscribe to it. And again, the subscription is free, but not only will we send the issue directly to your email box when we publish, but a little bit of a scoop. We're in the planning processes of doing a monthly newsletter in the months that we do not publish. So if you subscribe, you'll get a lot more useful, interesting content than if you're just browsing and run across something. So I urge you to subscribe.
I love a scoop. I did not know that until this moment. Thanks for sharing that. Isabella, Richard, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be here. Thank you.
Great having you. To our viewers, thank you as well. Hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.